Number 5, blended threats in JavaScript. So these two researchers, Phil Proviance, Josh Brashars, did some really cool research about mixing common web threats, things like cross-site scripting and CSRF, and all sorts of HTML5 techniques to actually translate to hacking the network from the web. So if we just move on here, we're going to the next slide. We're going to see the list of things that they've been able to do, right? So we could take XSS bugs in like routers, interfaces. They all have web interfaces, and actually utilize those to poke holes in an intranet network, right? Actually scan the network behind the firewall through the router, find out what computers are up and listening, what ports they're listening on, using JavaScript and common web hacks. And then actually the real juicy part of this hack, and the reason it made this list, is we've actually been able to flash the firmware of the router with some XSS file upload abuse and CSRF, and that leads to kind of more permanent compromise via web hacks. So on the next slide, we can see the technique that they use to scan the intranet. This is nothing new. You actually saw back in 2006 on the top web hacks list that these kinds of attacks are usually fairly popular, because I think there's something interesting about translating a web hack to a network attack, right? And we're not talking about, oh, the web, meaning you emailed someone a funny link of a cat and they clicked it. No, this is actual web exploits, cross-site scripting, and the sort. So here's some actual code that Phil and Josh published that they use to kind of help scan the intranet via JavaScript. And you can also see my little note here of HTML5. This WebSocket technique is new as of HTML5, and it's much, much, much faster than the previously used JavaScript intranet scanners back from 2006 that we were talking about, right? So here's some code. You can grab it. There'll be a link to GitHub in a second that will have a lot of this stuff we're talking about. So what's next in this attack? On the next slide here, you'll see that we have to gain access to the router, right? So you might think that some crazy hacker technique is needed to gain access to some sophisticated router out there, and then you look at routerpasswords.com and realize that you can teach your grandma to do this, right? So you go to the router aisle of Best Buy and you say, okay, they're selling neck gears like crazy. They're selling Linksys and D-Links. All right, let's see. Let's go onto this routerspassword.com, and here's all the default passwords. And almost all of them are some combination of admin and password, or blank values, or 1, 2, 3, 4. So pretty short list to guess from, but if you want a definite default password based on model number, here you go. And this will gain you quite easy access. So you might say, okay, this isn't something that is happening all the time, but on the next slide you can actually see this is happening on quite a wide scale in the wild today. So this is a news story from, what is it, Ars, from Dan Gooden, about a couple million routers that actually got compromised this way in Brazil. And they're going to use the rest of the techniques that we talk about to actually control permanently a bunch of just regular people, right? This isn't enterprises we're talking about. Who the victim here is you and I, right? Just your router at home. So on the next slide, you can see the less easy way, right? So instead of using the default password, say they change the default password a little bit. So we're going to have to be a little bit more hackerish to actually get this done. So there's two ways, right? You can either create CSRF, recreate the login form for the router. You can see on the top left the 192.168.1.1. That's a common router IP address. So you can create a CSRF form here to self-submit itself with the username and password, and kind of dump this into a script and keep trying until you get the right one. Or a lot of these routers actually use basic authentication. So you'll see the base64 header of the authorization header, which actually makes it even easier. If you have XSS in the router, you can actually you can make a lot of requests really quickly against basic auth and see the difference. So on the next slide, you can actually see where Phil did this. Phil and Josh. I think the stat was something about 100 attempts on basic auth brute force in less than 2 seconds using asynchronous JavaScript calls via cross-site scripting. So here he actually did this demo on stage at WhiteHat, and he had to actually put admin a few thousand attempts down just so that when he clicked the button for the demo that it didn't finish right away. But it actually looked like it was doing some brute forcing, because it was. And you can see all the different attempts here, and the response that you get is either a bad response or you get a 200 when the password's correct, and it actually takes a lot longer because it's loading some sort of web resource. So this script is also available. We'll see that link at the end. This is part of Phil's bundle on GitHub. So on the next slide, you can see the crux of what we're talking about. So everything that we've talked about so far isn't terribly new. It's a pretty cool combination of techniques to attack this router, but here's the bread and butter. So this file upload, like abusive functionality here, Phil actually was able to create a malicious firmware. I think it was based off of DDWRT, set whatever preferences he wanted, install whatever badness, man in the middle or like key loggers, whatever you want, and actually force the user via this piece of code right here to flash his own router, their own router, via some XHR requests. So I'm just going to leave this up on the screen if you guys want to digest this code for a few seconds. You can see the link in the bottom right to the GitHub SuperEver DDWRT install tool. That has a lot of the code that we're talking about. So if you want to take note of that, feel free. Phil open sourced a lot of this. It's pretty cool research when you actually, he on stage at WhiteHat via XSS and CSRF was able to permanently compromise and flash the firmware of a router. A lot of this is actually really hard to undo also, and you can imagine the nightmare that this would be on an enterprise side. So Jared, do you have anything to add about this one?
And that's the one that I think a lot of people still have trouble grasping at first when they come into contact with an internet attack. It's your browser, the victim's browser, that is the platform of attack. So you can kind of imagine your browser goes out to a public website, downloads the code that looks like this, and it's your own browser that's going to attack and flash your own router. And so you send this to home users, you put this on social networks or whatever the case may be, so it's their routers it's their browsers attacking their routers behind the firewall in the netted environments. Really cool stuff.
Yep, good point, right? So who's the victim here? Anyone with a web browser, right? So this is really nasty translation. These kinds of attacks make those top 10 lists every year, it seems like. Web hack, go to a website via your browser on your desktop, and all of a sudden something bad happens on your network. That's a pretty cool translation. So how do you protect yourself against this? I saw a few questions pop up about this already in the questions box. So on the router, quite the easiest way to protect yourself is change the default password. That'll stop the majority of this happening, right? Those early brute forcing techniques is just a word list against the router, the default router passwords. So if you're using the admin password functionality to get into your UI to do whatever you're going to do on your router, change that and make it something that's not easily brute forceable. Don't change it from 1234 to 12345. Actually change it, right? So that'll be the first step. And second step, obviously, this is just common XSS and CSRF protections, things like NoScript and request policy browser extensions in your browser. Whatever you feel comfortable with in your browser day-to-day life of protecting yourself against cross-site scripting, that'll also be the other side of protecting this.
The one thing that the research that we saw come up recently was, I forget the name of the research paper, even the researcher, so I apologize, but they looked at security products with web interfaces, and they found that 80% of them had web-borne vulnerabilities, particularly cross-site scripting and CSRF within them. So that's one of the biggest issues here, is that you're using the victim's browser to attack intranet devices, which rarely get patched and are not secure because everybody figures that the perimeter firewalls are stopping these attacks. So, we could say change the default router password, but that assumes that the router doesn't have a vulnerability in itself that the browser can't exploit, which is not a good assumption to make.
Right. So if you don't need this kind of thing to be available from the internet, don't have that either. Yeah, so I see some questions. Don't you have to have remote management enabled? Actually, no, because it is the browser on the intranet that is actually doing the hacking, right? So it's not these traffic is not coming from the internet straight to the router. It's coming to the victim's browser, which is on the intranet, which is not remote, and then that browser is actually firing off these brute force attacks. So that's why it's a combination of CSRF, right? You're forcing this browser on the inside to make the request to the router, which it's been trusting, and then moving on. So looks like we're